To add to that too, that's not necessarily unique to Kuwait. I think Peter said that you've seen these anti-terrorism courts being used as an excuse to crack down on human rights defenders and protesters around the region. The region is under incredible upheaval right now, by the way. I mean, there are protests happening in multiple countries. There's horrible crackdowns, and there's collapsing economies from Lebanon to Iraq to Iran, all the way into North Africa. So it's a historic moment, once again, in the Middle East and North Africa. But you also have these situations where you have this forced conversions that often are used to intimidate somebody who is being held or humiliate them. And that's standard in Gulf countries. It doesn't mean it's right. I just want people to understand just the scope of how bad it is when you're caught up by these governments. And one other thing that I've noticed, and I've seen an uptick in people that are being arrested in the region of dual citizen. They're dual citizens. They're Egyptian-American citizens or American-Russian or whatever. And I think it's something for all of us who are engaged in this space to keep an eye on, because I've seen less willingness from the current administration or members of Congress to actually get involved in situations where it's dual citizens, because it's looked as messy, and it's easy to point to the other country that person is a citizen of and say, oh, it's that problem, it's their problem as well. And then, believe me, the other country's going to point back at the United States and be like, no, it's theirs. He's American or she's American. And you have this weird dance where nothing is getting done diplomatically. And that's actually really, really dangerous, because you have these cases that will drag on and people forget about it. And a year goes by, and 2 years go by, 3 years go by, and all of a sudden the person passes away. Okay, so we don't want that to happen to any of these cases that we're fighting for. So I want folks here to understand that, if you're an American citizen, you're an American citizen. You may have another citizenship. We need our government in the United States government, to be engaged in all of these cases where people have been unjustifiably detained indefinitely. That's important. It's an important distinction that I wanted to add.
Yes.
So Marcia is probably the most prominent woman executive in the Mideast. I think without any comparison. 46-year-old woman born in Russia, went to Wharton, spent a lot of her life living in Pennsylvania, close to where I live. Her son, born in the United States, a U.S. citizen. Her mother, a Russian cardiologist, but a naturalized U.S. citizen. So she's 46 years old. She's a practicing Orthodox Christian woman. And she ran, together with her partner, a business in Kuwait that has a great relevance to the United States. So the business that her partner ran was responsible for unloading all the food and material for U.S. forces in the Gulf region and using the port of Kuwait. This was a very important contract, both for Marcia and her partner, but also for the United States. And as you can imagine, a very profitable contract. So one of the competitors, a company that is actually partially owned by the Kuwaiti government, decided that they would like to have that contract. And rather than bid fairly for it, they did what is probably the worst thing anybody can do in an organized society, which is use the criminal justice system corruptly to falsely charge, imprison, convict, and sentence someone who is completely innocent of the charges. So a lot of times as lawyers we say, there's insufficient evidence against our client. Well, that means maybe they did something wrong, right? In this particular case, in Marcia's case, there's no evidence whatsoever of criminality, criminal intent. So she's arrested on 2 charges, and to summarize them briefly, the first charge says you didn't perform services for the port of Kuwait. You signed the contract, we paid you money, you didn't provide the services, so she's charged with a serious criminal offense, for which she's sentenced for 10 years, spends over 450 days in jail, where she not only can't practice her religion, but she's prohibited from talking about religion or thinking about religion, and does some extraordinary things in prison, which tells you a lot about her. She uses her own resources, for instance, to hire lawyers for many of the other women in this very horrible, overcrowded prison, because she wants them to have some of the benefit that she has. So the charge is, you didn't perform these services. Well, the evidence for that is almost ludicrous, except it's not funny because somebody has gone to jail for it. The state of Kuwait had an auditor who was the main witness against Marcia. And the auditor said, yeah, I checked all the books and records and they didn't perform the services, and here's an invoice that she sent for work that was not done. Well, one problem with the invoice, it was a forgery, and it was made up by the auditor who was the investigator for the state. He had his own problems and had to plead guilty to fraud, but that didn't seem to convince the court that the whole case should be thrown out, which is what we argued it should be. The second case was, you invested a couple $100 million for the Kuwaiti government, and you stole the money, $490 million worth. The only problem with that charge is the money wasn't stolen. It was actually returned to the investors in Kuwait with a 30% profit. And the reason it was not quickly returned is the Attorney General in Kuwait put a freeze on the money and held it up in the UAE for several months, and that was the basis for charging her. So, we looked at all this evidence, we spoke to witnesses, we brought it all to the court, and unfortunately, the criminal justice system there, in this case, not just failed, but failed corruptly, because we're very, very convinced that her competitors corrupted the system to bring this charge against her, to put her and her partner in jail. And the first thing they did is they told the U.S. government, how can you do business with someone who's in jail? Well, they're in jail because you made a fabricated charge against them, and their liberties have been violated. So I could go on at length about the facts, but that's really all you have to know about the case. She's now in Kuwait, and thanks to the Russian government, she's under the protection of the Russian ambassador, her and her son. But she's trapped there unless we can get the charges removed or get some kind of diplomatic assistance and some kind of air cover from the United States government that will get her out of there. So I was pleased also to hear the President's declaration today, and we want to translate that into real-time action, particularly in her case, the other case of the Coptic Christian that you're going to hear about. It's what's very interesting about the case is we've worked hand in hand with the Russian government. Marcia, of course, is born Russian. She has a Russian passport. So it was a case where the U.S. and the Russians were completely aligned and together. Maybe one of the few instances in the Mideast where that's occurring. But we have the moral force of both governments, and more importantly, we have the facts and justice on our side, and we're not going to quit until her and her 5-year-old son, who's been bounced around from care of his grandmother to now sort of institutionalized care in the embassy, are freed. And her goal is to bring him back to Philadelphia and baptize him in the Orthodox Church there. So we've got a great cause, a great motivation, and we thank you all for your help. Thanks.
Thank you, everyone, and thank you, everyone, for coming today. I've had the privilege and, frankly, frustration of working on religious freedom cases all over the world, but particularly in the Middle East, where my parents immigrated from. They loved America when they came, and they still do. They were 2 different religions. They had 3 children who all practiced 3 different faiths. So I'm a living, breathing example of someone who truly believes in religious freedom, but also someone who knows the dangers of religious persecution. I was honored to be with the President and the Vice President and Secretary Pompeo this morning at the prayer breakfast. And I have been working on the Marcia Lazareva case and am very familiar with Rami's case as well in Egypt. And so if I may ask an action item of all of you, Twitter, as many of you know, is a very powerful tool in advocacy today. And if I may ask all of you to tweet at Real Donald Trump, at Sec Pompeo, and at VP, here we go, hashtag Kuwait, hashtag Free Marcia, hashtag Egypt, hashtag Free Rami. Thank you very much.